You first notice it in passing. A strange set of symbols on the corner of a receipt. Scribbles in the margin of an old notebook you don't remember writing in. It doesn't resemble any alphabet you know, not Arabic, not Cyrillic, not Sanskrit. It has curves where there should be angles, symmetry that only makes sense if you don't look too long. And even then, it feels familiar. You shrug it off, until it shows up again. This time it's in your dreams, painted on the walls of a room you've never been in. Spoken, softly, by a voice that doesn't quite sound like your own. You don't understand the words, but you wake up sweating, heart pounding, like something's been decided in your absence. The next morning, you catch yourself doodling those same shapes during a phone call. Automatic. Like muscle memory for something you were never taught. It's not a language you learned. It's a language that remembers you. That's what makes it different. Most languages are passed down. They evolve. They live through mouths and meaning. But this one doesn't evolve. It persists, hidden in the silence between words, in the static before a radio frequency catches, in the places your mind drifts when you're almost asleep, but not quite dreaming. Some call it a hallucination. Others call it a collective glitch. But the reports come from everywhere. Scribes in Ethiopia who swore their hands were guided by invisible voices. Medieval monks who woke with parchment covered in glyphs they had no memory of writing. Patients under anesthesia who muttered phrases in this tongue, later transcribed and matched to cave etchings found halfway across the world. No one can trace it, no one can translate it, but everyone agrees on one thing: you're not supposed to say it. The sounds come to you in pieces, a few syllables whispered behind your thoughts, shapes that seem to hum when traced with your finger. And if you do say them aloud, out of curiosity or fear, or just to see what they sound like, you'll notice something. Not a voice, not a reaction, a presence. As if something that's been waiting in silence has just tilted its head, not toward the world, toward you. Welcome to Tales from the Forbidden Library, where some languages were never meant to be learned, and some syllables don't echo, they respond. There's no consensus on when the language first emerged. That's part of the problem. It doesn't have a point of origin. It has patterns of return. It surfaces across timelines, locations, and cultures that never had contact with each other. Carved into clay in the ruins of Sumeria, etched into obsidian tablets in pre-Columbian Mexico, burned into the bark of trees struck by lightning in the Siberian forests. No culture claims it. No surviving society records it in their lineage. And yet it keeps appearing. Not in textbooks, not in structured inscriptions, but always in the margins of something else. In the liminal spaces, the moments between awareness and sleep. Found not by intention, but by proximity. It's like this language doesn't want to be discovered directly. It wants to be remembered. One of the earliest accounts comes from the journals of a 14th century monk named Etienne de Corbin, held in a private archive in Marseille. He wrote of waking each morning with fresh ink stains on his hands, his own journal filled with symbols he couldn't recall writing. The characters, he said, swam on the page when stared at too long. He reported headaches, auditory distortions, and the feeling of being watched from behind my own thoughts. The monastery where he lived was later sealed. The last recorded entry from another monk simply read, "He has begun to speak it aloud." In 1893, a group of early spiritualists in New England began experimenting with automatic writing. Most sessions were trivial, disconnected thoughts, symbols, nonsensical grammar. But one participant, a woman named Margaret Hensley, began transcribing what she called dream scripts. Over several weeks, she wrote hundreds of pages in a fluid, completely unknown script, without pause, without correction, without ever learning a second language. Linguists brought in to examine her work noted a consistent structure, patterns of syntax, and repetition in the symbols. as if it were a fully formed but entirely undocumented language. The project ended when Margaret stopped speaking altogether. Not out of trauma, her vocal cords were healthy, her mental state intact, but she simply refused to open her mouth. When asked why, she wrote, "I don't know what voice will come out." In 1978, a linguist named Dr. Ewan Merlo claimed to have discovered fragments of the language encoded into early Mesopotamian religious chants. Not embedded in the words, but in the cadence, the breath spacing, the rhythm. He believed the language wasn't spoken with meaning, but with intention, that it bypassed cognition and went straight to structure. "You don't learn it," he wrote. "You resonate with it." His research was shut down within a year. Officially, he'd suffered a breakdown. But in private letters, now held in a restricted archive, he confessed that he hadn't translated the language. He had begun to understand it, and that it didn't just communicate information, it revealed things not meant to be spoken. He referred to it as the echo script. His last letter ended with a single line: "They've started whispering back." Modern accounts are subtler. People report writing strange shapes while half asleep. Doodles on napkins, grocery lists that contain impossible characters, voice memos recorded at 3 a.m. that sound like static layered with intention. A few have posted images of these characters online. The posts don't last long, not because they're deleted, but because the files corrupt. View counts reset, metadata vanishes, as if the language rejects being archived. But what binds all these sightings is the same phenomenon. None of the individuals learned it. They didn't study, they didn't practice, they remembered. In dreams, in the quietest thoughts. In the place just behind language, where noise becomes shape, and shape becomes meaning. Some researchers now believe this language predates sound itself, that it was never spoken by humans, not originally. It doesn't function like other tongues. It doesn't label the world. It rewrites your relationship to it. Each symbol, each syllable, is not just a word, it's a command. One that alters the rules of space, memory, and presence. And the only thing keeping it dormant is silence. The warnings are always the same. Don't speak it out loud, not because it sounds dangerous, not because you'll drop dead the moment you do, but because something happens the moment the sound leaves your mouth. Not to the world, not at first, to you. The first recorded incident of someone knowingly speaking the language came from a sleep study conducted in Prague in 2004. The subject was a young man with no history of sleep disorders. During REM cycles, he began muttering strange syllables, syllables that matched no known language, but which, when transcribed, appeared eerily similar to symbols found in ancient Scythian burial sites. On the fourth night, he said one full phrase out loud, 4 syllables, soft, whispered. The moment he did, every piece of recording equipment in the room, audio, video, biometric, failed. Power didn't surge, it simply stopped. Like something had paused the room, then pressed play again, but just slightly out of sync. When the lights came back on, the patient was sitting upright, silent, staring directly at the observation mirror. He was never recorded speaking another word in any language, not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. The only thing he ever wrote days later was, "I heard myself twice." Others have reported similar anomalies. People who've uttered even fragments of the language describe the sensation not of being possessed, but of being duplicated, as if something else is speaking with you, beneath you, mirroring your tone, your cadence, your breath. Some describe a second echo layered beneath their voice, only perceptible when they're alone. Others feel the words returning before they've even finished saying them. A woman in Buenos Aires, who had been sketching symbols in her journal for months, finally attempted to speak one of the phrases aloud. She said it once, just once. Her husband reported that every clock in the house paused for 6 seconds, then resumed, off by exactly 6 seconds from universal time. From then on, her phone's voice assistant began responding before she spoke, not to her prompts, but to her intentions. Another case. A high school student in Vancouver said a phrase during a sleepover, imitating a creepy script he had seen in a dream. Afterward, every television in the house turned on at once. Not to noise, not to static, to a completely silent screen with dark, shifting lines that resembled written characters, faint and pulsing like breath beneath water. When they turned the TVs off, the phrase was still playing in the room, but not out loud. Inside their thoughts. It doesn't behave like a normal language. There's no grammar, no punctuation. The words don't carry meaning the way we're used to. They initiate. You don't describe with this language. You activate. Some scholars refer to it as linguistic ignition. You're not just talking. You're issuing instructions, though to what, no one knows. But what's consistent is this. Once spoken, the language doesn't leave. People report hearing pieces of it buried in music, conversations, wind patterns. One man claimed that after saying just 2 words, his dreams no longer belonged to him. That every night, he dreamt of someone else's life, not past lives, not fantasies, but full memories of a being that had never walked this earth. And sometimes, the being dreams back. There's an emerging belief that the language isn't just for communication. It's a call and answer system. A way to test if something beyond us is listening. A way to be found. And if you've already spoken it, even accidentally, it's too late to wonder what's listening. It already knows your voice. Most languages develop over time. They come from need, hunger, warning, love, territory. They grow in families, split into branches, evolve through contact. But this one doesn't grow. It returns. Every time it appears, it does so fully formed. Not changing, not adapting, just waiting. That's the first clue. The second is stranger. In every instance of the language appearing, whether scratched into walls, whispered in dreams, or spoken aloud, no one has ever been able to translate it. Not because it's complex, because it refuses to be broken apart. The moment someone tries to analyze it, the structure fails. The characters blur. The recording distorts, and the memory of what it meant slips from their mind like smoke through fingers. It's not meant to be understood. It's meant to be replicated. Occult linguists now believe the language is not human in origin, not demonic, not divine, just other. Something created outside the structures of syntax, emotion, and time. Something designed not to share information, but to complete circuits. Circuits that require sound, vocal frequency, breath. That's why it appears in dreams. That's why it waits in the margins of notebooks, on the tips of tongues. It doesn't want to be learned. It wants to be spoken, because speech is the act. Speaking it isn't the final step. It's the trigger. One theory suggests it was never a language at all, but a system of containment. That it was created not for communication, but for locking something in. Each phrase a seal, each symbol a sigil, not to open, but to hold shut. And over time, those who once maintained the structure forgot what it was. And the seals began to whisper. Another theory goes further, that the language isn't meant to contain anything, but to prepare us, to reshape our perception. That every time it's spoken, even in fragments, our reality shifts to accommodate what's coming through. That the language rewrites cognition itself, bending how we recognize space, sound, even identity. One researcher called it a tuning fork for the mind. He believed every utterance of the language nudges the speaker's brain slightly off axis, until eventually, the way you perceive the world no longer matches anyone else's. You begin to notice patterns where others see noise. You begin to recognize things that don't appear on camera. You start anticipating events by milliseconds at first, but then longer, until you're no longer living in the same time as everyone else. And what's worse is that this misalignment doesn't fade. Once you've spoken the words, your world doesn't snap back. It continues to drift, slowly, unnoticeably, until the only things left that can hear you are the ones that taught the language in the first place. Because here's the final theory. It was never meant for us to read aloud because it was never ours. It was left here, buried in minds, embedded in dreams. And the moment we say it, it doesn't activate us, it alerts them. And whatever they are, they don't knock. They just listen until enough people are speaking their tongue again. You might already know the shape of one. Maybe it came to you in a dream. Maybe it showed up on the edge of a receipt, in the corner of a classroom whiteboard, or traced into condensation on a car window. You noticed it, paused, and for a split second, felt like it was recognizing you back. That's how it begins. People don't stumble into this language. They resonate with it. It doesn't teach itself to just anyone. It looks for those on the edge, between sleep and waking, logic and intuition. The ones who ask questions that don't have words. The ones whose thoughts wander just far enough outside the line that the silence finds them first. And once it does, it doesn't rush, it waits. The characters will show up slowly, here and there. They'll make your handwriting curve slightly differently. They'll drift into your humming. They'll repeat themselves in the rhythm of footsteps behind you at night. What you must remember is this: do not sound it out. Even if the symbols feel familiar, even if they beg to be pronounced, even if they show up so often you feel you might go mad if you don't just say them to get it over with, don't. Because once you say it, even in jest, even to mock it, what was watching in silence knows where to look. And the effects don't begin with horror, they begin with recognition. A face in the crowd that smiles when you speak. A reflection that blinks twice. A recording of your own voice that answers you before you hit play. Then come the dreams, not of terror, not of death, but of instruction. Diagrams written in ink that never dries, rooms with no corners, eyes that blink behind glass. And in the center of it all, a voice that sounds like yours, but older, slower, speaking to something you can't see, in a language you now understand. By then, it's not about silence anymore. The words live inside you, and they will find their way out, whether you want them to or not. So if you've seen the symbols, if your hand begins to draw them without meaning to, if you've woken up mid-sentence, if you've ever hummed something unfamiliar and had the room fall quiet, stop. Because not all language was made to communicate. Some was made to remember, and some was made to return. If this story echoes something you've almost said aloud, leave a comment, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who writes in their sleep. Because once you speak the language, it doesn't stop listening.